Breeze is an easy-to-use yet powerful church management software that's used by more than 500 UMC churches to manage their database, stay connected with their congregation, manage events and check in children, and offer online and text giving. Best of all, it's only $50 a month. You can learn more about Breeze and start a free 30-day trial at breezechms.com. Start a conversation with your church. Dialogues On will engage your adult small groups in conversation around social justice topics like race, sexuality, and the refugee crisis. To explore what they mean to individuals and your church, learn more at wearesparkhouse.org/dialogues-on.
It seems like everyone has a podcast these days, from former presidents to your next door neighbor. And thanks to how easy and inexpensive it is to start a podcast, it really should raise the question, should you or your church start a podcast? On today's episode of the MyCom Church Marketing Podcast, we're talking about podcasting as a tool for church marketing and communications. Thank you to everybody for listening. My name is Dan Wunderlich. I'm a United Methodist pastor, and our guest today is Rev Todd Rossnagel. Todd is the Director of Communications for the Louisiana Conference of the United Methodist Church, and he's also the host of the Louisiana Now podcast. Todd, thanks so much for being with us today.
It is my pleasure, Dan. Thank you so much for the invite.
Well, let's begin by having you tell us a little bit about yourself, your career before joining the Louisiana Conference, and how you ended up working for the church.
Well, my history is a history in storytelling, specifically in journalism, is really what my first career was. My first career was involved in television journalism. I was a reporter and a television anchor working in Montgomery, Alabama for several years, and then in Baton Rouge, Louisiana as a morning news anchor. I left television news in 2008 and started working for a production shop and working for the state of Louisiana, really, for the Department of Economic Development. And as I often tell the story, the bishop took me to lunch one day. We had known each other, and she took me to lunch, and one thing led to another, and I was on this separate track of trying to explore the ministry call of my own, and she laid out what she had a vision for, kind of revamping the communications department here in Louisiana. And it suddenly hit me that everything that had been happening in my life professionally was leading to this particular point in my life and in the life of the conference here in Louisiana. And I will tell you that the first day on the job here in Louisiana as director of communications was the morning after the Alton Sterling shooting in Baton Rouge. And then 2 weeks after that was the great 2016 flood here in South Louisiana. And then it's just been one thing after another. So, we often say such a time as this, I have really lived that, and storms and communication and, that has been my daily bread really since we started here in Louisiana. But it's been great, and I really am doing what I believe I was called to do.
That's awesome. I went through the journalism school at the University of Florida. My degree's in advertising, but we also have quite a few members of one of the local news channels morning team that go to our church as well. So I love folks like you, and it's exciting to hear you follow the call of God. And one of the things that you do in that role is podcasting. And you were saying before we hit record how much you love podcasting, but you never really get a chance to talk about it as an art. And so I'd love to hear about your history with it. When and how did you first start listening to them? And when did you start making them?
Well, I think for me, I've been a podcast listener for a very long time. It probably started when I was able to search for topics on this thing we call a computer, which we didn't have when I was a child. But
Yeah.
when I was able to search for topics that interested me, so for me, it was anything related to the Chicago Cubs, my favorite baseball team.
Mm.
Suddenly, I was able to get information related to the Cubs by sources other than the traditional media. And so that's really when I began kind of listening and subscribing and back in the day downloading an MP3 of a podcast onto
Yeah.
your little device that you would have in your pocket. Honestly, for me, when podcasting first started, the episodes were sort of long and drawn out. I mean, I listened, but not that regularly. I mean, I just didn't have 90 minutes to digest the Wednesday doubleheader against the New York Mets. I
Right.
mean, it
Yeah.
was probably fascinating stuff, but it was just a little too long. I think podcasting took a positive turn for all of us about 8 to 10 years ago when the episodes became shorter,
Mm.
a bit more produced. An example I give would be maybe Serial Podcast on
Yeah.
NPR or S Town. I remember being just completely engrossed with that S Town podcast. Shows that were produced very well, and went away from this 90 minutes of drawn out, poorly produced, which were still interesting. But when they started to get produced and a little bit honed in, that's when I really became a huge fan of podcasting.
And are the podcasts that you've done through your role at Louisiana at the Louisiana Conference, are those the first that you've actually made? I know you've worked in TV and journalism, so you've done lots of audio and video recording. But as far as actually dabbling in making podcasts, was Louisiana now your first one?
It was, and it's funny because when we first started in 2016, one of the things that I told the bishop, I said I would love to start a podcast, and we just never could really get around to producing one. And I'll talk about this a little bit later, but over analysis tends to lead to paralysis,
Yeah.
and that was the case with me. I just couldn't figure out, what are we going to call this thing? What are we going to do? What are we going to talk about? And then all of a sudden, the pandemic hit, and for us, it was a germ-free way to tell stories. I am really a videographer by trade, with my background in television, and I used to always just grab my video camera, go out and do video interviews and produce video stories. And during the pandemic, we just didn't want to do that, right? I mean, you just 6 feet apart, and
Yeah.
it made videoing very difficult, especially during the shutdown. So podcasting became a natural way for us to be able to say, hey, jump into a Zoom call or a Zencaster link, and let's tell stories. So that's how it really started.
That's awesome. Well, we're going to do a follow up episode to this, listeners, next month, where we get into the nitty gritty of producing podcasts and how you can get started for as little as literally using the tools you probably already have either in your pocket or in your church sanctuary. But really, the first question we should ask is not how do I start a podcast, but should I start a podcast? So, Todd, let's start with the positives. What are some of the opportunities? You've already sort of touched on that a bit in how you all told stories through the pandemic, but what are some of the opportunities that podcasting presents in general, not even necessarily specific to church?
Well, for us, it's an opportunity to go deeper. I talk about this all the time. You have videos where you can see and hear from folks, but honestly, the attention span for videos these days is just incredibly short.
Yeah.
You just can't engage with an audience these days. I mean, you can, and there's certain channels and certain videos that will draw people in, but you just can't engage as you probably once did with video. Um, you can't engage the audience in a way that you can with a podcast.
Yeah.
You have written pieces in communication work, which are important, but again, podcasting is just so different. You can't hear a person struggle with their answer. I mean, you might write that the person, let's say you write that the person shrugged her shoulders and their head sunk as they answered, I've lost hope.
Yeah.
But when you're able to hear that they've lost hope, and you're able to hear the struggle behind the answer, it's just different. And I also say that podcasts are somewhat escapism for some people. Think about
Mm.
what you're doing when you listen to podcasts. Most people are doing some sort of activity that requires them to disengage from their thumbs on a screen.
Right.
So, what I mean by that is like, you're likely cooking or driving or exercising or gardening, and so the podcast can almost be an escape tool, and you can, really with a lot of production work, which I know you guys are going to get into, you can really take the listener on a journey.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's it's this fine balance of remembering that the vast majority of people listening to podcasts are doing something else, and so you maybe can't be guaranteed that there's 100% focus, but at the same time, like I just moved, we just bought a house and moved, and there is a lot of overgrowth in the backyard, and I would knock out 4 hours of just grueling yard work, but podcast made it go by in no time, and I'm doing
Right.
work that I can just turn my brain off and listen, and I'm so grateful for all of those things.
Yeah, and I think for again, the question being, should you produce a podcast? It really comes down to, do you have enough bandwidth and the
Yeah.
ability to do that? But I assume that if people are listening to this right now, that they have a general interest, and the larger interest is you have an opportunity to really take people to a different place, and really engage different parts of their brain. I honestly believe that with podcasting.
Well, what are some of the unique opportunities that come to us as church storytellers? What are some good reasons why a church might want to start a podcast?
Yeah, that's a great question, Dan. And I think it's perhaps the most important question to answer before you jog down the road of podcasting,
Right.
because if you don't know your why, um, you you got to know your why before you know your what. Knowing why you're doing what you're doing will help you immensely. But so there are two whys, I think, to this answer. For some, it might be because they've heard that their church members are big consumers of podcasts.
Mm.
Others might see the podcast as perhaps a unique tool in their social media toolbox. And then others might find it to be an incredibly useful tool to unpack something, as I said earlier, that requires a bit more in-depth focus. Um, but I think the first answer that comes to mind is what I remember my mother always telling me before I loaded up my plate. You got to finish what you start. You
Yeah.
don't want to
Yeah.
start something, gain an audience, even if it's a small audience, and then not sustain it. So you got to be very careful there. Um, but yeah, I mean, that's you got to know the why before you start doing anything.
Well, then let's go on the flip side of the coin, because we don't want to give too many concrete examples of why, so we don't narrow people's focus. But perhaps maybe as some guardrails, what are some reasons a church might not want to start a podcast?
Well, as I just mentioned, I'd be very careful if you start something and then you abandon it. The temptation will be, this show isn't gaining traction, so let's stop. Um, but you don't want to do that. You want, because it's not about traction, it's not about statistics, and maybe we'll talk about that later. But if you start something, see it through, be committed, because you will gain an audience if you stick it out. Another thought here is that try not to start a podcast because you heard it's a cool thing to start.
Yeah.
If you don't consume podcasts, don't produce one. I always say this: produce what you consume. So find someone on your team who does consume podcasts. I have a garden at home just like you, and my wife and I try to grow tomatoes. Now, if if I was allergic to tomatoes, it would be sort of pointless for me to grow
Yeah.
tomatoes. So, produce what you consume. So that would be one reason why you should not start a podcast. If you're not really into it, if that's not something that really moves you, and you're not going to pay much attention to the finished product, that might be a reason not to do something.
Well, and that leads us into the next bit, is that probably the easiest way for a church to start is by just posting their sermons. My church does that. Plenty of churches do that. And obviously, as a church marketing and communications tool, it can be an effective approach if you're trying to reach folks in your community. who are maybe nervous about coming in the front door without having heard whether the pastor's, okay or not, or crazy or not, or is super, uptight, or is more a style that they like listening to, or even if you're the kind of church that would like to reach beyond your geographic area. Sermon podcasts can be helpful, or can be a tool. But I don't know, Todd, if you've been listening to the rise and fall of Mars Hill. They began to use, podcasting of the sermons as a way to create and build the celebrity of the pastor, which of course then derailed the whole focus of the church. And so there's good
Right.
and bad ways, but probably you're already preaching through a sound system. All you really have to do is throw an audio recorder connected to your soundboard, or if you're live streaming, there are even tools you can use to download your video, extract the audio, and clip it down. And if you're not a technical person, that sounds like it's so complicated, but it's not. And we'll get into that next month. But maybe what are some thoughts you have about the sermon being a primary podcast for the church? Is it a good idea, bad idea, or maybe like it's okay, but I'll let you take it, Todd.
I think the answer is yes to all of that. I think the first benefit is it's produced. I mean, the thing is the thing, and you maybe slap,
Yeah.
as you said, an intro and an outro to it, and you can produce it fairly easy. And that's actually a huge benefit for folks who have a lot on their plate. That is a
Yeah.
huge benefit. Another benefit is it's a very easy way to share your sermon. During the teeth of the pandemic shutdown, we had a pastor who found that sharing the podcast of the sermon was far easier to share than to try and post and produce a video of the sermon. But outside of that, I would really push churches to just do a little bit more work here and
Mm.
think outside of the box, just outside of just pushing up their weekly sermons. It is a safe bet. It is an easy win. Um, but I think churches can do better, says the guy who does not have a church.
Yeah.
So it's very easy.
And now let's take a brief pause to hear a word from our sponsor. Start a conversation with your church. Dialogues On will engage your adult small groups in conversation around social justice topics like race, sexuality, and the refugee crisis. To explore what they mean to individuals and your church, learn more at wearesparkhouse.org/dialogues-on. And now, back to our program.
Well, I thinking through my head, and we'll talk about some of this next month in our practical approach to podcasting. But this is less podcasting, like how do you make it, but more of an approach. So I'll ask you too, Todd. What are your thoughts on starting a podcast that's either weekly, bi-weekly, or monthly versus going the season format? Because especially if you're not doing sermons, and we can talk in a second about what are some other genres or styles of podcasts we could do. There's the approach of we're going to put one out every month, we're going to put one out every week, or there may be podcasts like some of us are familiar with maybe someone like Malcolm Gladwell, who does 6, 8, or 10 episodes all in a row, and then he's off for a couple months, making a new quote unquote season. What's your thought on the consistency of every week, every month, or going in seasons, or is it really just setting up the expectations with your listeners?
I think it really comes down to what do you want to produce. So, an idea that I would have for local churches of kind of thinking outside the box, so to speak,
Mm.
is your sermon is designed to be delivered in front of an audience, whether that audience is through a camera lens or an audience that is sitting in pews before you. And so it's not necessarily designed specifically for the podcasting format.
Yeah.
But if you have a sermon, so let's say you are preaching a sermon on the prodigal son, and you spent all of your focus on your sermon on the younger son, and you know that there's a whole lot to be said about the older son, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And you could easily say, later this week we're going to unpack some of the things that didn't make its way into my sermon, and I'm going to have a guest that's going to help do that, and we're going to talk about that. Or if you have a sermon series, there are a lot of things that don't make its way into the sermon
Yeah.
that you could easily unpack later in the week for a podcast episode. Or that's one idea. Another idea is as we go through Lent, we're going to do 40 days of meditative reading or meditative messages on the 40 days of Lent. And we're going to make that a seasonal packaged thing. Or we do that during Advent, or we do a back to school series. So I think, a lot of pastors and a lot of church leaders will do a lot of hard work in January to say, okay, what is this year going to look like? What are we
Yeah.
going to be able to offer people? So reverse engineer it from Christmas back. How can you fit podcasting in, and what do you think you'll be able to pull off from a staffing and a bandwidth perspective
Mm.
that you'll be able to hit? So, Dan, I think the answers are really it's all over the place. I mean, we try to do our podcasting. We initially set off to say we're going to do one a month, and now we're up to almost one a week. But I never try and put anything into a box, because then you've limited what that creativity can be. So I think it's all over the place. But I would just encourage folks to try and plan it out. There's a lot of ideas that are out there.
Oh, definitely. I was chuckling because I think there are probably plenty of Sundays where my congregation maybe wish I had cut 10 minutes out and put it in a podcast rather than making them sit 10 minutes longer on Sunday morning.
We can
Uh,
chase a lot of rabbits, right?
we sure can. We sure can.
That's the beauty of scripture.
Well, and one of the things I like about the podcast that you do, I was able to scrub through a couple episodes, and it's not outside, and part of, so your Louisiana Now podcast, you share various stories from around the conference. And certainly that's tied into your background as a journalist. So that's kind of right up your alley. And this may be difficult if you're pastoring in a super small town. But we keep saying, our churches always say, we love our town. We love, I'm in Sanford and Lake Mary, Florida. So I love, the Sanford Lake Mary community. What if I actually made a podcast that demonstrated that love by bringing on city council people, small business owners, the kinds of people who are the heart of the community, and just learning about them. And it's one of those things where you as a church maybe aren't necessarily directly preaching the gospel, but what you are doing is trying to create connections in your community by creating a venue for people to get word out about what they're doing, and also for all of us to get to know each other better. What do you think about an idea like that?
Absolutely. And then one of the upsides to that, Dan, is you immediately have an entirely new audience that will be sharing your podcast.
Yeah,
So if you interview Sam the Butcher about his job and where Sam the Butcher finds Christ in what he does, Sam is going to have family members, friends, an entire Facebook feed that when Sam shares that podcast, you have an entirely new group of people that are going to be
yeah.
exposed to your work. So I think that's a fantastic idea.
Well, let's go ahead and shift gears. We'll skip ahead. Let's say we've got an idea for a podcast that we're pretty excited about. We've got the technical side of things figured out, the recording, the hosting, distribution, those kinds of things. What are some tips that you have for someone who's maybe getting ready to launch a podcast? How important are things like the name, the cover art, or for even lack of a better term, the marketing that we use when we start telling people about our new show?
Yeah, I think it's extremely important. Good design will always at least lead a consumer to check something out. It doesn't necessarily result in great content, because the content will drive the content. But things like cover art and font choices, all of those things, they're extremely important. But like I said earlier, overanalysis can lead to paralysis. So,
Yeah.
I often tell people, you have, I mean, you start thinking about microphones and what to buy. You go on Amazon and start looking for microphones, and it's just like, oh yeah, there's just where do I start, right?
Yeah.
And I often tell people, you have a microphone in your pocket. It might not be the greatest microphone, but I can't tell you how many times I've recorded from the field with my iPhone. So
Yeah.
it just do it. Get started. Move the ball down the field 10 yards, and you will eventually begin to gather experience, gather feedback from your audience. You'll be able to hear, join some podcasting groups on Facebook. Say, hey, what do you think of this? There will be positive criticism that will land in your lap. Just continue to move the ball forward. So I think cover art, name, theme, all of those things are important, but don't let it paralyze you from starting.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And this episode is, at least as we're recording it now, planning on being released in early to mid-November. And so if you, we will not have out the episode where we're talking through gear until December, but in a couple weeks might be some Black Friday sales. So if you've got your eye on any podcasting equipment you might want to launch in 2022, in a couple weeks, you might be able to find some good deals. But really the minimum bar for a listenable podcast is cleared by your iPhone. I mean, the tools that we have in our pockets now are so great for even YouTube, like even just filming or live streaming all of these things. I think we've learned that these tools are far more versatile. I am on a broadcasting mic, and I've had it for quite a number of years. And there are some days where I kind of wish I didn't spend as much money as I did. I'm glad I have it, but the tools now are just so much more accessible, and like we said, things you might already have. Well, Todd, let's talk about expectations. One of the big numbers we are all going to look at, whether it's healthy to do so or not, is our download numbers, right? We're going to hit publish. We're going to wait a couple hours. Then we're going to hop on our hosting site and hope for the best. According to some stats over the summer from Libsyn, which is one of the major podcasting hosting services, to be in the top 50% of podcasts, at least on their service, you only have to have more than 128 downloads per episode, which is just crazy right there, and perhaps a really good adjustment of our expectations. If you think you're going to put out a podcast and immediately have 1,000 listens per episode, it's probably not going to happen. If you have 128 or less, you're in the bottom 50%. But it also means that if you can build an audience, and if you are podcasting as a church, you likely already have a core group of people that can grow, if not is already bigger than this size, can grow to this size pretty easily. Some other benchmarks: over 1,000 puts you in the top 20%. To be in the top 10%, you need more than 3,000. The top 5% is 7,100. The top 1% is 32,000. It starts to get exponential. That's when you're starting to hit podcasts hosted by probably celebrities and people who have big time social media followings. But Todd, how do you set realistic expectations for yourself and your shows?
I do not look at numbers at all. I don't look at them. I just absolutely ignore numbers. Now, that may be dumb on my part.
No,
um,
I think that's admirable.
but I just don't look at them. I produce and share, produce and share, produce and share. And my gauge for am I making an impact? Are people listening? Is my ear is set to the ground, and we share a lot of our podcasts on Facebook.
Mhm.
Facebook is, for us, we have a lot of eyes on our conference page on Facebook, and we use this free tool. It's called Headliner. I know you guys are probably going to talk about it, but it's an easy way to turn little snippets of your podcast into these little video waveform videos that are quite shareable and really play well in the social space. And it's absolutely free of charge. I don't know how they make their money, but actually they have a pro plan, so I do know how they make their money. But so the engagement there, I will arrive at our annual conference and people will come up to me and say, I love the Louisiana Now podcast. We have little Easter eggs hidden inside our podcast from time to time where we ask for people to email the show and to call our hotline and leave us a message. And so it's more about making a connection and hearing from my colleagues and our audience that they are engaged in the show. And I will also say this: I don't think that I don't think you have to have huge numbers to be wildly successful. Think
Yeah.
about it from a sermon perspective. All you're asking to do is to preach or share the message with that one person who needs to
Mhm.
hear it at
Mhm.
that particular point in time. And so trying to produce something that will be as popular as some of the NPR podcasts. I just think that is an exercise that you're just wasting a tremendous amount of energy trying to produce something that honestly is just not your calling. Your calling is to share a story and let the story share itself. That's honestly where I come from on that.
Well, that's great. And that's really, kind of leads us in perhaps to the last step, which is, um, and you mentioned tools like email, and you've got uh, some sort of hotline folks can call into, and obviously you monitor engagement on Facebook. How do you keep your ear to the ground? How do you engage the audience? How do you ask for feedback? Are there any calls to action that seem to be working well, or is it just sort of you keep an eye on what are the episodes that resonate and make more of them like that? I sometimes get frustrated. The first tool in successful content marketing is make the content your audience wants, and it's like that is absolutely true, but it's also not as simple as it sounds.
Yeah, we've had a few moments where we have said, give us an idea for a show. Call us, send us an
Mm,
email. We need show ideas. And people have responded. People have said, hey, I think you maybe ought to do a podcast on this or a podcast on that. And so that's been fruitful. It's been a fruitful exercise to ask for help. I often say, if you don't ask, they won't respond.
yeah.
Immediately after the hurricane, we had our hotline set up for our podcast, which is just a way for people to dial in and leave us a voicemail if they want their voice to be heard on the podcast. And I thought for a long time, I'm like, why am I doing this? Are we doing this to gain ideas? And I thought, we played around with it for a little while, and then right after the storm, speaking to Bishop Harvey, I said, you're getting messages from some of the other bishops across the connection who are sending us messages. Do you think a few of them would call the hotline and leave us
Mm,
just a brief message? And they did. A lot of them did. And so we had these wonderful, beautiful 60 to 90-second messages from bishops all over the connection in the week after the storm. And it was one of my favorite episodes just to hear these messages of hope from bishops all across the world who were calling in and telling the good folks of Louisiana that everything will be okay. And so um, that was a way where the hotline actually worked,
yeah.
and it turned into a good thing. So, I think that the more you ask for help, the more people are going to respond. But you have to be willing to ask. You have to be willing to say, "Hey, we need story ideas. We need your ideas to help keep this show alive."
Absolutely. And that's a great way to help your listeners feel invested in the show. We've taken
Absolutely.
opportunities throughout the show to share feedback or share stories, share ideas that people have, and ways in which the things we've talked about have either worked or honestly not worked sometimes in their local context. And of course, there's always that like, oh, did I hear my name or hear my voice on this? That's let me just stop and unroll my thoughts here. Podcasts, even if there's only 50 or 100 people listening, for them it's coming through the same channel as the NPR podcast or the podcast with their comedian that they listen to, or if they're listening to it in the car, it's coming through on radio. And so when you say their name or you play a clip of their voice, for them it is like they got on the radio,
Right.
even if it's just this small little show that reaches a small little audience. You can create this incredible connection because of how we listen to podcasts. So I don't know, that just crossed my mind there.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, like I said, you have this opportunity, especially if you've set yourself up with the right sharing tools and the right way to share your episodes, which is really important to be on all of the channels that people listen to podcasting. And I'm sure you guys will get into how you can. It seems difficult to say, find our podcast on Spotify, but it's actually fairly easy. But if
Yeah.
you have it to where people can share very easily, they'll share it. They will share the episode that they're on, and their friends and their family will share it. And that's the best way to grow a podcast.
Absolutely. Well, Todd, do you have any closing thoughts or words of encouragement? And then also, if folks want to reach out and say hi or ask a question or follow your work, what's the best way for them to do that?
Well, my email for the podcast is very simple. It's podcast@la-umc.org. You can reach us there. And Dan, look, I will say this. We have we have a media world that is just so busy, and there's just so much out there, and so many people they have so very specific lanes that they stay in
Yeah.
with news and stories that are cultivated to their likes. We have an opportunity, and I would say it's really a mandate from Christ to share the good news with as many people as possible. We have the greatest story ever told that continues to get told. And we have an opportunity to share that story in unique and dynamic ways. And it is a privilege and an opportunity to do that. And I just thank God that I have the opportunity to do that. I thank God that we have the gifts and the tools and the resources to do that. It's exciting, and I would just encourage people to get excited about storytelling and telling the story of Christ alive and dynamic in 2021.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your time today, Todd. We really appreciate it.
Dan, thank you.
And now, listeners, we want to hear from you. Have you thought about starting a podcast at your church? What are some of your creative ideas for podcasts that connect with your community beyond the walls of the church? Email us at podcast@umcom.org, and we just might share your thoughts or stories on a future episode. And you can, of course, use that email, podcast@umcom.org, to send us any feedback or topic suggestions you have for the show. We always love hearing from you. And as always, the easiest way to support the show and help other church communicators like yourself find it is by sharing this episode with your friends and colleagues, and by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or whatever service you're listening to us on right now. And did you know that United Methodist Communications is celebrating 80 years of ministry? Your support ensures that the latest denominational news, dynamic stories, and informative articles will continue to connect our global community. Make a tax-deductible donation today at resourceumc.org/giveumcom. Thanks again for listening to the MyCom Church Marketing Podcast.